turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast, the programme where we bring you the biggest breakthroughs and talk to the major movers and shakers from the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith. And this week, our Titans of Science series is back for another run. And to kick us off, marine biologist Richard Thompson, who first brought to the world's attention 20 years ago the problem that is micro and now nano plastics.
From Cambridge University's Institute of Continuing Education, this is The Naked Scientists.
Richard Thompson was born in Nottingham in 1963. He attended Ernell Junior School and Arnold Hill Comprehensive School in the city and later went on to study at Newcastle University and the University of Liverpool. In 2004, Richard was internationally recognised for coining the term microplastics, and he's been at the forefront of research that's fundamentally changed our understanding of plastic ocean pollution ever since. Over the course of his career, Richard's led influential studies on the sources, the distribution and ecological impacts of microplastics, helping to shape global policy discussions on plastic waste and marine conservation. He's currently a professor of marine biology at the University of Plymouth, and he leads the university's International Marine Litter Research Unit. I'm very delighted to say he's met me here in London to talk about his work.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show.
Now, why did you end up looking at microplastics at all? Were you already a marine biologist by that point?
So I guess I was studying for my PhD, and I'd got experiments set out on the shore, marine ecology experiments looking at actually microscopic algae and the mollusks that feed on them. And every day I went to kind of tend these experiments and do the counts and the observations. And virtually every day I got items of litter clogging up the experiments. Of course, I had to remove them. And then the next day there was more. So I joined together with some of the other students, and we set up beach cleaning around the local area where we were. But something struck me that started off the story really of the microplastics from my perspective, was that as I was entering all of this data into the sheets, I realised that there was something missing. That what to me was the most abundant type of litter on the beach, which was the small fragments of plastic. There was no category for it. And this kind of question struck me. I wonder what the smallest bits of plastic are on the beach. And so that was a question that motivated me. A couple of years later, when I started to teach undergraduate students myself, one afternoon I said, let's go and have a look on the beach. I've got this question I want to answer. I wonder what the smallest bits of plastic are. And the students said, well, let's look in the sand. And I thought, well, okay, let's look in the sand. So we brought back some sand samples. And pretty much from the first sample, we could see bits that didn't look like sand, brightly coloured bits, blues, greens, reds, and quite a few that were fibrous in shape. And they certainly didn't look natural, let's say. It was then an almost forensic journey to confirm what they were. And indeed, they were a range of different common polymers that we were finding, some of them smaller than the grains of sand themselves. And that's what motivated me then to explore a little bit further. How widespread is this phenomenon? We looked at beaches from around the UK. We looked at sediments from the seabed. And in all of these samples, we could see these strange bits, and we could confirm common polymers, polyethylene, PVC, polystyrene, polypropylene, all of the everyday common polymers we were finding. And then I was curious, of course, has this problem got worse over time? Because we've only really been mass-producing plastics since the 1950s. And again, I was looking for ways to do this, and it was about the time that I relocated to Plymouth. I got my first lecturing post there as a sort of permanent position. And I work with the Marine Biological Association, who hold this continuous plankton record, where they've got archived samples of plankton that collected over the last 70 years, and what we showed was there was a significant increase over the decades. So this information really was gathering almost as a trickle. It wasn't my regular line of research. One of my supervisors when I was a postdoc kind of saying to me, it's all right, we're really happy for you to do this work on the plastics, but you need to keep it a bit for the evenings and weekends because it's not quite what the grant's paying you to do, which was fine, and it was said in very good humour.
But when did it dawn on them and you? that this was actually the thing to spend your working life working on and commit the other stuff to the evenings and weekends, because this is absolutely massive.
A pivotal moment. This would have been in the late 90s, probably about 1998, 1999, somewhere around there. I presented this seminar at lunchtime to some of the postdocs and PhD students in the lab, again, mainly marine ecologists. And it was, OHP slides on an OHP projector and a few photographs. And anyway, one of the researchers who was, a bit more senior than me, he said to me, he was Italian, and he said it with quite some panache and charisma. He said, "This is your boat, Richard. This is your boat. This is the thing that nobody is working on. This is what you should pursue." And I thought, okay, well, yeah, maybe, Paolo, I thought. But this kind of kept coming back into my head when we were pushing on with this story. Yeah, well, he saw it as a career boat, if you like, as something that nobody else was working on.
Had you by then considered the problem internationally, or was this very much you were looking at UK samples, so it was very local? You obviously must have thought, well, this is everywhere, so we must spread our wings internationally and then make it a global problem, and then I'm almost certainly going to get more support for this.
So at that time, it was national, that I was looking at beaches around the UK. I was going back in time with the archive plankton samples, which again were from UK waters. I mean, it was almost a decade from first asking that question about what's the smallest bit of plastic to publishing this first paper using the term microplastics. And indeed, my first paper on plastic pollution in 2004. So it was gathering this information over time. What are the polymers? What are the habitats we're finding them in? How common are they? Have they accumulated over time? And quite a critical step was, do organisms eat them? And you might think, well, probably for sure they do if they're in the environment. But when you're looking at small particles like this, lots of organisms, filter feeders, have got ways of getting rid of natural particles. They're encountering sediment every day, so maybe they'd get rid of the plastic and wouldn't ingest it. But we showed that a range of creatures, filter feeders, deposit feeders, and detritivores would all readily eat this plastic. It didn't yet prove harm, but it showed the pathway.
How did you show that they were eating it? What were you looking at?
So we did a range of laboratory experiments where we had creatures in tanks and we exposed them to small fragments of plastic. And with some of these creatures, because they had sort of more or less transparent bodies, you could actually see the plastic in the digestive tract, for example, of the amphipod. And so all of that information went into that first paper in 2004.
We first met around the time you published that paper, and one of the things that galvanised me, and I suddenly understood the risk here, was you pointed out to me that these plastics are made of hydrocarbons, and just as birds of a feather flock together, oily chemicals stick together. And you made the point, look, these plastics are out there, they are encountering other potentially toxic chemicals at low concentration, and they may be well concentrating them into and onto the plastic. And then when they go into microorganisms or bigger organisms, they could dump that toxic cargo. And that's when I think I had my wake-up moment for this.
Yes, and that was a wake-up moment actually for policy. The first policy-related meeting about microplastics was held in the US actually, and there were only a handful of scientists there. There was myself and one of my early postdocs, Emma Teuton, and there was a colleague that's become kind of a lifelong friend called Shigi Takada from Japan, and he'd previously shown in his research this potential for plastics in seawater to absorb and concentrate contaminants. So contaminants, man-made chemicals, if you like, persistent organic pollutants, a range of other chemicals present in seawater would become super concentrated on the surface of plastics because those chemicals were hydrophobic in nature. And it's a little bit like if you've ever washed up in a plastic washing up bowl, perhaps a spaghetti bolognese or a curry, and it's had food dye in it. Often that dye latches onto the plastic because it has a greater affinity for the plastic than the seawater. And that was what Shigi Takada demonstrated was happening with some of these hydrophobic contaminants. And so the question struck me, well, what happens if those plastics move to a different chemical environment, perhaps the guts of an organism, where if it's a warm-blooded creature, you might have a different temperature. You'd certainly have different chemical conditions. You might have enzymes acting. Would some of those chemicals be released? And indeed, that is what we showed, that if you let plastic acquire a burden of chemicals from the natural environment at concentrations equivalent to what you'd find those chemicals in the environment, and you then moved the plastic to either clean water or clean chemical constituents resembling the contents of the guts of an invertebrate or a warm-blooded creature, what you saw is the chemicals being released. But the interesting thing was that the rate of release could be up to 30 times greater into a warm-blooded creature than the rate of release back into clean seawater.
So 2 questions then. One, if we go and sample seawater, do we see this mechanism happening for real? So having demonstrated it's theoretically possible, have we got evidence that this sort of concentration chemically is occurring? And 2, have we got evidence that with that having occurred, if it does, it really does impart into the bodies of marine organisms, therefore dumping the toxic cargo in and concentrating it into them?
So there's really clear evidence that the phenomena was occurring in the natural environment. The question was then, we've got this concentration mechanism, we've got the increased release. How much worse does the plastic make it? Because, of course, here, if you're dealing with chemicals that are already in the environment, marine life is already exposed to them. So the critical step was to understand how much worse does the plastic make it. And what we showed, interestingly, was yes, the plastics had a role, but compared to the intake by diet, and if you're passing seawater over your gills, direct from the water, that the role of the plastic was quite trivial at that time in terms of the transfer of chemicals to the creature. So it was part of the picture, but it didn't seem that the plastic was making things all that substantially worse. But what I would say to that as a caveat now, because of course our understanding of plastic pollution and these small particles has increased a lot, that we were working at the time on, if you like, a standard gut transit time. So the amount of time the plastic was in the body and the amount of time it would have to release those chemicals. And of course what we now know is that the really small particles, down a few microns but certainly into the nanoscale, have the potential to pass from the digestive tract into the circulatory system and to pass around the body very rapidly. We've shown in marine mollusks within 6 hours of exposure in a fish tank that the nanoparticles of plastic have gone literally everywhere in the tissues. And then if you move those mollusks to clean conditions, even after 28 days, you can still detect the presence of the nanoplastics in them. In terms of harm, I would see that there's 3 different routes. And there's the physical presence of the plastic causing some sort of disruption. You can picture that easier with a big bit of plastic causing an obstruction in the digestive tract. And there's evidence of that longer-term accumulation in mollusks in the hepatopancreas, which is analogous, if you like, to the liver. There's also the potential for chemical toxicity, where you've got chemicals that are already in the environment, anthropogenic chemicals accumulating on the surface of the plastic, becoming super concentrated, and then released to a creature upon ingestion. But on top of that, there's also the potential for chemical additives that were incorporated into the plastic at the time of manufacture. Now, these are chemicals that are put there mostly, but not all, put there with good reason, but some of them are known to be harmful in the wrong context. And for that reason, we have certain chemicals such as phthalate plasticizers that are prohibited for use in children's toys and in applications in hospitals because of the known adverse effects of those chemicals. But if we've got plastics that have got these additives in them that have become very small pieces, in the wrong context, there's also the potential for those chemical additives to be released. And interestingly, what the work where we were looking at the chemicals accumulating from the environment soon realized was that the concentrations of some of these additive chemicals in the plastic could be far, far greater than you'd ever achieve by this mechanism of the chemicals absorbing to the surface of the plastic. But the key question there is about, well, what's the exposure pathway? So what are there instances where we've got plastics that contain potentially really hazardous substances that are finding their way into the environment already as small particles, rather than perhaps having to take years to fragment. And the interesting one that's come onto the horizon there most recently is particles from tyre wear every time you drive along the road. And of course, tyres aren't food contact material, they're not part of children's toys. There's a wide range of chemicals that are potentially very hazardous incorporated into tyres. Again, many of them put there with good reason, but potentially hazardous. And what's happening as you drive along the road and put the brakes on, of course, you're getting that particulate dust arising from the tyres immediately. And that's washed from roads when it rains. It's carried into watercourses. And we've proved that those tyre wear particles can pass through wastewater treatment and into the marine environment. They can also be washed directly into streams and rivers. And some of them, of course, become dust into the air that will then settle back into the environment.
What's the evidence? Having shown this is plausible as a mechanism for delivery and physical insult to living organisms in the marine environment, what's the evidence that it is doing harm? Have we got any yet?
There's now a substantial body of laboratory evidence that microplastics have the potential to cause harm. And I say potential because it's always the dose that's the poison. And there's been recent modelling work done in the Netherlands that's looked at all of the studies. And, there's now over 4,000 studies using the term microplastics. Back in 2004, there was only the one that used it in this context. So there's a whole range of studies, lab experiments that have demonstrated harm. That could be reduced growth, reduced ability to put on weight, reduced reproductive output. I mean, only a week before last, we heard about potential effects of really small particles on photosynthesis. So there's been a wide range of adverse effects that have demonstrated. A key question there is, are those lab experiments done at environmentally realistic concentrations? And the challenge here is actually we don't know with absolute certainty what the environmental concentrations of microplastics are. Why? Because they're particles of a whole range of different sizes. And when you get to below a few microns in size, they're almost impossible to pull back from an environmental sample of sediment or seawater or whatever it might be and confirm that, hey, I've got a piece of polystyrene. Picture a small piece of plastic that you could see in your hand the size of a sugar cube breaking into 2 pieces, into 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. You can predict how many nanoparticles there are, but we don't know with absolute certainty how many there are and the size distribution down to those really small pieces. But where I'm going with this is that the modelling predictions based on the best estimates of environmental concentrations, and of course those estimates vary from one place to another. Some habitats are more contaminated than others, but those estimates suggest, linking to the lab studies, that what we're probably seeing in the natural environment at the minute is fairly isolated harm from microplastics. We already know the larger plastic litter is causing harm, but from the microplastics at current concentrations, we're probably seeing harm in the natural environment in a smallish number of isolated places. But the interesting thing is that the modelling predictions suggest if we don't change our ways, in the next 70 to 100 years, that problem will escalate. And so what we will see is adverse effects in the natural environment on a very wide scale.
If it's in the fish and I eat that fish, does that mean that I'm at risk? Is this going up the food chain? We often talk about things concentrating up food chains, mercury and so on is one classic one people point to, isn't it? Do microplastics and nanoplastics behave like mercury?
No, they'll certainly pass from one creature to another. So they'll pass along the food chain, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of biomagnification, which is what you're referring to in the mercury, that larger creatures are accumulating more than the amount kilo for kilo. So it's sort of, as the creature gets bigger, the relative amount of plastic is bigger. But there's not any evidence at the minute of magnification. But absolutely, microplastics are in the water we drink, they're in the food we eat, and they're in the air we breathe. So they're in us as humans. And people ask me, of course, about the harm to humans. At the minute, the evidence that we have is correlative evidence that's pointing towards the potential for adverse effects on humans. What I would say, and I'm not, a medical scientist, I would say, the number of experiments we've got across the rest of the animal kingdom pointing to adverse effects, we are just another animal. So why would we be surprised to see that evidence of harm to humans as well as to the rest of nature that's been studied? Because we could spend a decade trying to establish that direct causal link between micro and nanoplastics and adverse effects on humans. We've already shown it in a wide range of animals. It could cost millions to establish that. And when we've shown it, what do we do with that information? We're still going to need to address the problem. So my question is, where is the tipping point here? We've shown that there is harm from plastics of a range of these sizes, particularly the larger stuff, to wildlife, economic harm, and potential harm to human health and well-being. How much more evidence do we need before we start to take action? And I stress the importance of these larger items of plastic, because once they're in the environment, they fragment progressively over time. And so the larger items of plastic litter of today are some of the microplastics of tomorrow. We need to make those changes now. We don't need to wait for further evidence about effects on humans, in my view at least.
People are beginning to explore new forms of plastic that are more biodegradable, won't have this hundreds to thousands of year-long lifetime where they have the chance to fragment into tiny particles with potentially pathogenic effects. Is that the answer? Do you think we have to just have a big shift away from making plastics the way we have and just have to surrender what is a wonderful material but which has a toxic legacy in favour of ones that are much better for the environment?
The biodegradable plastics have a role in this, but they're not in any way centre stage as a solution. If you think of the things that have made plastic materials so successful, it's the fact that they're lightweight, they're inexpensive, they're versatile, and they're very durable. A lemonade bottle, you need to rely on it to hold that lemonade as long as you want it, on the supermarket shelf, on the back of your car, on a hot summer's day, on a cold, rainy day. How is that lemonade bottle going to magically know the minute you've consumed the drink and it's somehow become litter in the environment and it's now time to self-destruct in a meaningful time scale? If we can make them biodegrade rapidly and harmlessly and not accumulate in the soil, but if we can design polymers in those settings where we've got a very specific life expectancy of the polymer, it doesn't need to be durable beyond a few months in the growing season, for example. Or the other example is perhaps where we've got food wrappers maybe served at a large venue, a pop concert, football stadium, where the time that the food is needed is quite short-lived, over a few hours. And you've got a big venue with a single organisation controlling the food that comes in and the wrappers that come in, and critically also the waste that goes out. And there's the possibility for wrapping the hamburgers in a compostable wrapper, and the half-eaten hamburgers and the wrapper can go to a commercial composter. Unless those plastics can get into the right waste stream, they're not going to achieve any beneficial effects.
So would you advocate we need to get back to the good old days of glass bottles, the ones we used to collect up in crates, and you get 10p for each of them at the local off-licence?
Well, there's a number of things there. I mean, glass is certainly heavier than plastic. So if you do the assessment of the impacts and you look at it from a carbon perspective, the packaging is lighter in plastic than in glass. If we can get those plastic bottles to be more circular, and there's good evidence of high recyclability for milk bottles, for example. So I don't think it's necessarily about going back to glass. The idea of the deposit on the bottle could be an incentive to get people to return their bottles, and we've seen that working with deposit return schemes on plastic bottles in other countries, so that could be an advantage. But a key part of getting this circularity to work is going to be simplifying the formulation of the plastics. You know, if I think even about the plasticizers that help to make the plastic bendable, I understand there's over 24 different formulations of plasticizer. Why have we got those? Because different companies are, of course, not wanting to pay exorbitant rights to one initial patent owner, so they've tried to develop their own plasticizers. All well and good so far, but if you're a recycler faced with this diversity of 20 different chemicals that all do the same job, it makes it quite challenging to then recycle that material into a viable product. And of course, it's not just the plasticizers. Recent studies demonstrated there are over 16,000 different chemicals associated with plastics and plastic production. And around 4,000 of those chemicals, back to the earlier question about chemical release, are known to be potentially harmful. So I think if we're going to aim for increased circularity via recycling, that's going to have the biggest potential for single-use plastics, where the benefit to society is short-lived and the potential to turn those end-of-life plastics into new plastics is quite high. And let's not forget that of the 400 million tonnes of plastic we produce every year, about 40% of those are destined for those short-lived applications. But to get that circularity to work, we've got to dramatically simplify the chemical formulations. We've got to harmonise the way we do things so that you can mix, lemonade bottle of brand A with lemonade bottle of brand B with a container of the same plastic that didn't contain lemonade, and you can recycle them without resulting in a product that is inferior. So recycle is in there, but we've got to go a long way to getting that to work. Less than 10% of all the plastics we produced have been recycled, and there are lots of challenges there around the potentially hazardous chemicals that are used and the fact that that's difficult for a recycler to know what is coming into their plant. So we start with reduction, right? And there are clearly plastics, particularly some of the single-use ones, that we don't need, or at least I would say we can't afford the luxury of them, given all of these external environmental costs and potential cost to human health that I've talked about. So we need to reduce. If you look at the curves for predicted production alongside our ability to manage the waste, those curves are escalating away from each other. This is not a problem that can be solved by waste management alone. So we can't afford the luxury of some of this throwaway plastic, whether it's single-use drinking straws, single-use plastic carrier bags, the microbeads in cosmetics that are now, thankfully banned in many countries. So we need to think about developing essentiality criteria for plastic products, because it's clear that they all have the potential to be hazardous if they get into the wrong context. Then, for the plastic items that are essential, we need to make them safer and more sustainable than we have done to date. And that sustainability needs to be reflected in either reuse formats or recyclability.
I was very relieved when we went for a coffee just before we got together that you produced your reusable coffee cup and castigated my single-use, but I didn't have the forethought to think I'm meeting a plastics recycling man, and I should be more cognizant about bringing a coffee cup I can reuse. How do you sleep at night? Because the thing is that now you've identified this problem, everywhere you look in the world around us, you see more of the same. You see the problem amplifying. I go shopping and I shudder. And it was you that did it to me, because I look at the shopping and the amount of plastic waste I generate from my weekly shop fills a bin. It doesn't seem like we can serve anything anymore without wrapping it up in layers of plastic. So what do you do to relax? Do you get any respite, Richard?
Plastics aren't the enemy. Plastics bring immense societal benefit and can bring environmental benefit. You think of lightweight parts in cars and aeroplanes. You think of the many applications in hospitals and schools. Even the single-use packaging that we might pick on actually extends the life of food and drink in supermarkets, in our homes, and it reduces food wastage, which is another major environmental challenge. So the solution isn't about trying to ban plastics from our lives. The consumer will have a key role in that solution, but at the minute, education as how to use plastic more responsibly, we have a slightly broken system. So we need to go right from the drawing board to design plastics in a way that's safer and sustainable. We need to make sure when we're thinking about designing a plastic product that we've considered its end-of-life fate and how it should be disposed of and what the options might be. That's going to be very context-specific. It's going to be different in the UK, where I have the benefit of a quite sophisticated recycling truck arrive out on my doorstep once a week, to communities that I visit in Indonesia, where literally the only means of getting rid of the rubbish is either to burn it, releasing potentially toxic gases, or to throw it into the local river, because there is no other collection. But it's really critical that we think about that at the design stage, we design plastics that are safer and more sustainable, including what happens at the end of life. And to me, it's a tragedy when I talk to product designers, even of the single-use plastics, that they say to me, end of life? I was never asked to think about that. I was simply asked to make a product that performed and was attractive to the consumer. And that's a major part of why we've got the problem that we have. It's not that plastics can't be safe and sustainable. It's that we failed to even think about making them in that way.
A very important message, and one we would do very well to heed. Thanks very much to our titan of science this week, Richard Thompson. Now, next time, our series will continue with Sarah Russell, who's a planetary scientist charged with analysing rock samples that have been brought in from outer space. How amazing is that? Join us next time to hear what she's been up to. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It is supported by Rolls-Royce. And if you'd like to support us, please go to nakedscientist.com/donate. We're really grateful to everyone who either gives us one-off contributions or some of you who give us a monthly contribution to the programme. We really are grateful. It makes a massive difference and helps to keep the show on the road. Thank you again from all of us. I'm Chris Smith, and from the whole team here at The Naked Scientist, we look forward to your company next time. But until then, goodbye.